The summer sun hung low over the McCready Ranch that afternoon, and Martha watched from the main house as her granddaughter Sarah sat beneath the old palm tree near the barn, looking small and defeated. The girl had arrived 3 days ago with bruises on her arms and legs and a hollow look in her eyes that made Martha's heart ache in ways she hadn't felt since losing her own daughter years before. Sarah was 14 now, and the divorce between her parents had turned ugly in ways that children should never have to witness. Her mother had thought a few weeks at Grandma's ranch might help, and Martha had agreed immediately, though she worried her quiet life here might not be enough to reach a child carrying such heavy wounds. She had called Tom Wilson that morning. Tom ran the neighboring spread and had a way with broken things, whether they were horses or fences or hearts that had been battered by life's cruelties. He was 62 now, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of decades under the western sun. But there was a gentleness in him that Martha had always admired. When Tom arrived on his bay horse that afternoon, he didn't head to the main house. Instead, he rode directly to where Sarah sat and dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent his whole life in the saddle. Martha watched from the window as he crouched down in front of the girl and spoke words she couldn't hear. Sarah looked up at him with suspicion at first, and Martha understood why. The girl had learned not to trust the adults in her life and had learned that kind words could turn sharp without warning. But Tom just stayed there, patient and still, until finally Sarah gave a small nod. He stood then and offered his hand, and after a long moment she took it. Martha felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Tom help her granddaughter to her feet and lead her gently toward the barn. She had asked him to give Sarah a riding lesson, thinking perhaps the horses might reach the girl in ways that words could not. Animals had a way of teaching trust that humans sometimes forgot. But as Martha watched, she realized Tom had something else in mind entirely. Inside the barn, the air was sweet with hay and warm with the presence of horses in their stalls. Sarah followed Tom slowly, her bare feet making soft sounds on the wooden floor. She had refused to wear shoes since arriving, and Martha hadn't pushed her about it. Some battles weren't worth fighting, and some freedoms were more important than others. Tom led her past the stalls to the back of the barn, where a ladder climbed up to the hayloft. He gestured upward and said something Sarah couldn't quite hear, and then he began to climb. She hesitated, looking back toward the door where escape waited if she needed it. But something in the way he moved without rushing or demanding made her follow. The loft was dim and golden, with afternoon light streaming through the gaps in the boards. Hay bales were stacked along one wall, and the space smelled of summer and growing things. Tom settled himself on a bale and patted the spot beside him. Sarah sat but kept distance between them, her arms wrapped around her knees. For a long time, Tom didn't speak. Just sat there looking out through the gaps in the barn wall toward the pastures beyond where his horse grazed peacefully. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly in the silence. Most adults she knew couldn't bear quiet, and rushed to fill it with questions or advice she didn't want. Finally, Tom spoke, and his voice was low and calm like the rumble of distant thunder on a summer evening. He told her about his daughter. He told her that Emily had been just about Sarah's age when his marriage fell apart, 30 years ago. He told her about the fights that had echoed through his house and the way his daughter had tried to make herself invisible, and how he had been so caught up in his own anger and pain that he hadn't seen what it was doing to her. His voice caught slightly when he said that Emily had stopped talking to him for almost 10 years after the divorce. He told Sarah that those were the hardest years of his life, and that he had carried the weight of his failures as a father like stones in his pockets, but he also told her that Emily had eventually come back, that she had forgiven him not because he deserved it, but because she chose not to carry the anger anymore, that they had rebuilt their relationship slowly and carefully, like mending a fence one post at a time. He told Sarah that Emily was married now and lived 2 states away with 3 kids of her own, and that they talked every Sunday without fail. Sarah listened without moving, and for the first time in days she felt something crack open inside her chest. This man wasn't trying to fix her or tell her that everything would be okay. He was just sitting beside her in the wreckage and showing her that survival was possible. When he finished speaking, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something small, It was a smooth river stone worn round by water and time. He held it out to Sarah and told her that Emily had given it to him years ago, when they first started talking again. She had found it on a walk and said it reminded her of him, hard and weathered, but still whole. He said he had carried it ever since as a reminder that broken things could heal, even if they never looked quite the same as before. Sarah took the stone and held it in her palm, feeling its weight and warmth. She wanted to speak but didn't know what to say, and Tom seemed to understand that too. He stood then and offered his hand again, and this time when she took it there was less hesitation. But instead of leading her back down the ladder, he walked to the far corner of the loft where an old trunk sat covered in dust. He opened it carefully, and inside, Sarah could see photographs and letters and small treasures that spoke of a life fully lived. Tom pulled out a leather journal, worn soft with age and handling. He told Sarah that he had started writing in it after Emily stopped talking to him. He said it had helped to put his feelings down on paper when there was no one to say them to out loud. He held it out to her and told her she could have it, not to read his words but to fill the empty pages that remained with her own. He said sometimes the hardest part of healing was having nowhere to put the pain, and that writing it down made it feel less like drowning. Sarah took the journal and held it against her chest like armor. Tom smiled then, and there was such kindness in his eyes that she felt tears spring to her own. He told her one more thing before they climbed back down. He said that what her parents were doing to each other wasn't her fault, that divorce made people into strangers sometimes, and that they said things and did things they didn't mean. He said she didn't have to forgive them if she wasn't ready, and she didn't have to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. But he also said that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and hoping the other person would get sick. He said she could choose differently. She could choose to let the anger go, not for them, but for herself. She could choose to build a life that wasn't defined by their mistakes. The walk back down the ladder felt different somehow. Lighter when they emerged from the barn. Martha was waiting by the fence, and the look on her face told Sarah that she had been crying too. Tom nodded to Martha, and then swung himself back up onto his horse. But before he rode away, he looked down at Sarah and told her that he would be back tomorrow if she wanted to talk or just sit in silence. He said his barn was always open and his hayloft had plenty of room for thinking. Sarah watched him ride away, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt something like hope stirring in her chest. That night after dinner, she sat on the porch with the journal in her lap and the stone in her pocket. Martha brought her lemonade and settled into the rocker beside her. Her grandmother didn't ask about what happened in the barn, and Sarah was grateful for that. Instead, Martha told her stories about her own childhood on this ranch, about the hard times and the good times and the way life had a habit of surprising you when you least expected it. She talked about losing Sarah's grandfather to cancer 20 years ago, and how she thought she would never laugh again. But she did laugh, eventually, and she did find joy again, even though the grief never fully went away. She said grief and joy could exist in the same heart, and that one didn't cancel out the other, as the sun set and the sky turned gold and pink. Sarah opened the journal. She didn't write anything that night, but she liked knowing that she could. She liked having a place that was just hers, where her thoughts could live without judgment. Tom came back the next day and the day after that. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they just sat in the hayloft watching the light change. He never pushed her to share more than she was ready to give, and he never made promises he couldn't keep. He just showed up steady and calm, like the seasons, by the end of the first week. Sarah had started to help with the horses. Tom taught her how to brush them and check their hooves and clean the stalls. He showed her that caring for something outside yourself could be a kind of medicine. The horses didn't care about her parents' divorce, or the bruises on her legs. They just wanted hay and water and a gentle hand. There was freedom in that simplicity. By the end of the second week, Sarah had filled 12 pages in the journal. She wrote about her anger and her fear and her confusion. She wrote about missing the way her family used to be before everything fell apart. She wrote about feeling invisible and wondering if anyone would notice if she disappeared. But she also started to write about other things, about the way the horses nickered when she approached, about the taste of Martha's homemade bread, about the quiet strength she saw in Tom's weathered hands. One afternoon, while they were sitting in the hayloft, Sarah asked Tom why he had helped.